It was a completely ordinary Tuesday morning inside the primary school of Kalachi, a small, isolated village in northern Kazakhstan. At 10 a.m., classroom of children was quietly working on an assignment. Then, an 8-year-old boy simply dropped his pencil. His head hit the wooden desk with a heavy thud. The teacher walked over, assuming the child was just exhausted. But when she gripped his shoulder to wake him, his body was entirely limp. He wasn't asleep. He was utterly, terrifyingly unresponsive. Within seconds, a girl 2 rows away collapsed onto the floor. Then another child. Then the teacher herself staggered backward, her eyes rolling up as she crashed into the chalkboard, instantly slipping into an unnatural coma. By noon, the biological anomaly had breached the school walls. Grown men were falling off their bicycles in the middle of the street. Women were collapsing over their stoves while preparing lunch, their central services shutting down without a single warning sign. The most terrifying part of the Kalachi anomaly wasn't the sudden, unbreakable sleep that paralyzed the village. It was the horrifying state the victims were in when they finally opened their eyes 6 days later. To understand how an entire town becomes a biological ghost story, you have to understand the geography of Kalachi. It is a tiny, dusty settlement completely isolated in the vast northern steppes of Kazakhstan. With a population of just over 600 people, it is the kind of quiet agricultural community where nothing out of the ordinary ever happens. When the first few adults suddenly collapsed into heavy comas in March of 2013, the local clinic wasn't panicked. The doctors assumed it was a standard, easily explainable rural problem. They diagnosed the initial patients with extreme physical exhaustion or suspected they had consumed a bad batch of counterfeit vodka. It was a perfectly logical medical assumption. It gave the village a reassuring sense of false security. But whatever was infecting Kalachi wasn't alcohol. It was just getting started. Weeks later, the anomaly escalated. A local man was driving his motorcycle down the main road with his wife on the back when his central nervous system simply switched off. He woke up in a hospital bed 6 days later with zero memory of the crash. Then, the phenomenon crossed the biological barrier. Family's cat began violently attacking the walls in a panicked frenzy before collapsing onto the floor, snoring heavily like a human being, completely unresponsive to pain or sound. And then, the children started dropping. When the doctors examined the massive new wave of patients, their blood work was perfectly normal. Their vital signs were stable, but their consciousness was trapped in an unnatural paralysis. The clinic was forced to officially classify the epidemic as encephalopathy of unknown etiology. In the medical community, that is a terrifying catch-all phrase that translates to one thing: we have absolutely no idea what is shutting down their brains, and we have no way to wake them up. The true horror of the Kalachi anomaly didn't happen when the villagers fell asleep. It happened when they woke up. When a human being is trapped in a coma for 6 days, medical science expects them to wake up severely lethargic, but peaceful. The residents of Kalachi woke up screaming. As the paralysis finally broke, the patients were violently thrust into a state of waking delirium. Their minds were completely fractured. A local farmer woke up thrashing against the clinic nurses, absolutely convinced that a massive invisible snake was coiled inside his hospital bed. Young children, some as young as 8 years old, would suddenly bolt upright, crying in sheer terror because they could feel invisible worms actively eating the flesh off their hands. Others reported giant, deformed winged horses standing silently in the corners of their bedrooms. Even worse was the cognitive wipe. Grown men who had lived in the village their entire lives would open their eyes and stare blankly at their own wives, having absolutely no idea who they were. The memory loss was absolute, and the disorientation was terrifying. Desperate for an answer, the Kazakh government deployed a massive investigative response. Over 20,000 individual clinical tests were ordered. Biohazard teams tested the soil, the groundwater, the livestock, and the local food supply. Every single test came back completely negative. There were no viruses, no bacteria, no poison. By the winter of 2014, roughly a quarter of the entire population had simply dropped. Over 140 people. The local hospital wards were overflowing with comatose patients, lying side by side in complete, unnatural silence. The doctors were defeated. The government was baffled. But as investigators began mapping out the exact locations where the victims had collapsed, they noticed a terrifying geographic pattern. The anomaly wasn't a biological virus. The anomaly wasn't a biological virus. It was geographical. To find the source of the nightmare, investigators had to look just past the borders of Kalachi toward the dead city resting directly in its shadow. A sprawling, decaying ghost town known as Krasnogorsk. During the height of the Cold War, Krasnogorsk was a highly classified, closed Soviet settlement. It didn't even exist on public maps. It was built for one specific, secretive purpose: to house the thousands of workers who mined the massive, subterranean uranium deposits directly beneath the earth. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, the operation was immediately abandoned. The immense labyrinth of underground shafts was simply left to rot, slowly flooding with millions of gallons of groundwater. When investigators overlaid the coordinates of every comatose victim onto a topographical map, a chilling alignment emerged. The people weren't collapsing randomly. The highest concentration of sudden onset comas tracked perfectly along the wind currents, sweeping down from the abandoned Krasnogorsk mine shafts. Panic swept through the investigative teams. They immediately assumed the villagers were suffering from acute radiation poisoning. Radiological hazard units were deployed to sweep the homes of the sleeping victims. But when the Geiger counters were activated inside Kalachi, the readings were completely normal. There was no radioactive fallout. Whatever was creeping out of the black depths of the Soviet mine and suffocating the village wasn't radiation. It was something completely invisible. The solution to the Kalachi anomaly wasn't found in a hospital laboratory. It was discovered buried deep underground, hidden within the dark physics of the decaying Soviet mine. When the government abandoned Krasnogorsk, they didn't just leave behind empty tunnels. They left behind thousands of tons of timber, used to brace the massive subterranean shafts. For 2 decades, those wooden structures rotted in pitch blackness, slowly drowning as the mine naturally flooded with stagnant groundwater. This created a terrifying, unseen geological reaction. As the timber decayed in the flooded, oxygen-starved environment, it generated colossal pockets of carbon monoxide and hydrocarbon gases. But these toxic gases didn't just leak out in a steady, predictable stream. They were trapped underground, building into a hyper-pressurized, invisible reservoir. The trigger for the outbreak wasn't biological. It was barometric. Forensic climatologists realized that whenever the atmospheric pressure above ground rapidly dropped, it created a vacuum effect. The sudden change in pressure violently sucked the massive pockets of toxic gas out of the abandoned mine shafts. It rolled down the hills, entirely invisible, and settled directly over the village of Kalachi. Carbon monoxide is a perfect assassin. It is completely colorless and entirely odorless. It doesn't make you cough. It doesn't burn your eyes. It simply enters your lungs, violently bonds to your hemoglobin, and blocks oxygen from reaching your brain. The children dropping at their desks and the adults collapsing in the streets weren't falling asleep. Their central nervous systems were actively suffocating. And the terrifying hallucinations, the invisible worms, the snakes, the violent paranoia, they were the desperate, neurological misfires of human brains being starved of oxygen, violently trying to process the trauma of suffocating from the inside out. Once the exact physics of the anomaly were understood, the Kazakh government made a swift and definitive ruling. The village of Kalachi was officially deemed uninhabitable. An immediate evacuation was ordered, and families were systematically relocated out of the toxic blast zone. The official case file was permanently closed. The verdict: rotting Soviet timber and severe carbon monoxide poisoning. But not everyone bought the government's explanation. Many residents flatly refused to leave, convinced that carbon monoxide couldn't possibly account for the sheer scale of the mass paralysis, or the intensely specific, shared hallucinations of winged creatures and invisible parasites. They believe the official report is a convenient lie, a hastily constructed cover-up designed to hide the lingering effects of classified, radioactive Cold War experiments still actively leaking from the Krasnogorsk mine. To this day, a fraction of the population remains in Kalachi, living in the shadow of the dead Soviet city, terrified of what happens when the wind changes direction. What do you believe? Was this a freak geological accident? Or is the official explanation covering up a much darker Cold War secret? If you are fascinated by unexplained medical anomalies and deep state mysteries, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I will see you in the next deep dive.